that fascination still was there with me. Obviously, my course was computer science. And at that time, I particularly hated looking at websites that didn't look good.
That is indeed, a lead developer advocate here at Salesforce. I'm Josh Burke, your host for the Salesforce Developer Podcast, and here on the podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. There, Aditya is talking about his early experiences building out web pages and web applications, which led to his experiences that we're going to talk about today, which includes building a snake game with Lightning Web Components. But we start about how his previous role is similar to his current one as a developer advocate.
I was actually a part of the pre-sales team also in my previous company, and that also involved building demos, which I seem to like better than building solutions based on customers' requirements. So this is like a full-time opportunity where, explore something new, build demos on that, and inspire developers. Yeah, you don't have the pressure of deadlines, at least for most of the time. Of course, Dreamforce and all is different.
every now and then, yes.
Yeah, but then, you get to work at your own pace. So that gives a lot of room for us to think creatively. So that is what I love in this role. There is no deadline hanging on your head.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely some advantages to working for a client that's totally fictional. So, yeah, I hear you there. Well, let's talk about some of that stuff that you've been doing. You've got this video doing wonderfully on YouTube. And I want to talk about the content, but I also want to talk about the style because it's come up before in my conversations, like with Kevin and with Mo. And you're building a solution slowly, mistakes and all, going back, fixing your work, etc. What's the advantage of that style of video as opposed to, say, a really polished video where you're only showing like completed code that you know where everything works?
So in my personal opinion, I think for developers who are watching the video, doing it from scratch is more relatable. I mean, if you show a fancy demo and you say, all of this is the code behind it, and you just highlight one or two lines, they know that, okay, this is possible. But then when you build it from scratch, you actually show how you as a developer think through the solution. So it's not just about writing that piece of code. You also talk them through the process of, okay, so now here is a requirement and here is my thought process on how I want to build it. So in a way, to the developers watching the session, they don't just learn how to write that piece of code, but they also learn how to think of a solution for that problem.
Yeah, one of the things I love about it is that you actually go to Google to cut and paste code that you know, and you actually quip in the video endpoint that you're doing it simply because it's faster and it's easier to pull it straight from the documentation and then just put it into your code.
Yeah, that's true with almost all the developers. I'm really using the word almost because I want to be inclusive, but I think it's just all the developers.
Yes.
And why do I need to remember something if I can just copy paste it from Google?
Yeah, no, it's be turned into an ongoing joke on the pod that Stack Exchange is one of my favorite IDEs. So I completely feel you there.
Yeah, and the advantage for me, at least clearly, is spelling mistakes. So I don't forget a letter when writing something and bang my head over, oh, what's the mistake? It looks almost exactly identical.
Right. Okay, so specifically the first video we're talking about, it's about building a snake game in LWC, which brings me to my first question on that. Why build a snake game in LWC?
Okay. So that's actually an interesting question. So even I did not start off by thinking, okay, let me develop a game on Lightning Web Components. It just struck me. So during this whole lockdown, when everyone of us was sitting at home, I don't know about the US, but at least in India, Ludo King as a game became very popular.
Really?
Yeah. So almost anyone you see is playing Ludo, and it's quite addictive. And one of my friends who also works in the ecosystem, he said, okay, let me try building Ludo on Salesforce. I thought, that's a cool idea. And then it struck me, okay, building Ludo looks a little bit complicated with all of the different pieces falling together. You'll have to put a dice in between and all of that. So I just Googled, how do you build games using JavaScript? And that is when I saw Snake Game being a very popular video out there in the JavaScript
Got it.
world. So I thought, yeah, let's do that using Lightning Web Components. And one problem off the bat I faced was that most of the videos only talked about building games using HTML5 canvas.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's easy. I mean, you just draw a canvas and everything else you do is a canvas function.
Yeah.
I thought, no, that's not going to add any value to LWC.
Right.
So I had to dig further in the internet to look at some code samples on how people did it with pure JavaScript and not using canvas.
Got it.
And that is when I started building it using Lightning Web Components.
Mhm.
And then what I realized is there are some decisions that I took when building the whole grid. If you watch the video, there is a grid that I built.
Mhm.
And the way I render the grid, I did it in one way. And then when I was looking at the output, it turned out it was not performant enough. So there was a lag in the game. So then I had to tune some parts of the code, which is when I realized, okay, this is something interesting and it's also fun. So let me do it as a Trailhead live session. So that's
Got
how
it.
the session came about to be.
Okay. Now, one of the early on, you state very directly that you yourself don't want to be in charge of manipulating the DOM. And why is that good? Like, it feels like it's actually a best practice for Lightning Web Components, but describe to me why.
Okay, so in general, when you try to manipulate DOM using JavaScript, it's slower. And the way Lightning Web Components addresses that fact is that it has a binding between the JavaScript code that you write in the HTML file.
Mhm.
So we have implemented all these decorators like track, which is no longer necessary for most use cases. So the framework itself implicitly knows how to render the DOM, and it does it in a more performant way. I mean, I think the LWC team has spent a lot of time making sure LWC is performant. And they have already considered all these cases where you update something in the JavaScript file and then it in turn reflects something on the DOM. So they know how to do it efficiently versus you manually querying a DOM element and then adding its property. So it takes up a lot of time for it to go through all of the DOM elements and then pick a particular element and then render its style. So there is a lot of repainting that happens and the DOM queries is generally slower. So that is why it is listed as a best practice. So we generally use that.
Well, and I appreciate that because I remember my early days of JavaScript was nothing but DOM handling and nothing but DOM handling through two browsers at the same time, like fighting between Netscape and Internet Explorer. And so it's just kind of nice to see development finally get to a stage where you're just sort of letting the framework do all the work for you and you get to do all the cool, fun stuff. Quick question on the track, because you ended up having to track a variable. So what's the distinction in modern LWC between variables you need to track versus the ones you don't, you know, to put in the track annotation to make sure that the client is going to get updated?
Yeah, so that's a tricky concept back then, but I think we relatively simplified the way we message it to developers. So basically, when LWC framework launched, to make sure a property was reactive, that means if the property is updated, the UI has to be updated. So to make sure that happens, you had to explicitly put track as a decorator in front of the property. But in about 6 months or so, we removed that necessity. And the clear distinction here is, I mean, as a developer, if you're listening to this podcast, if you want to remember when to use track and when not to use track, any primitive variables are tracked by default, which means if you declare something like a string or a number, those are primitive data types like a date. All of those are tracked by default. But if you have non-primitive data types like arrays and maps, those are not tracked by default. And there is actually a distinction in that as well. So when we say tracked, it means whenever there is a variable reassignment, that is when the UI gets updated. So let's take this example. Okay, I have a Boolean property. So I declare it to be false in the beginning. Now, when I update it to true, it means I'm actually reassigning the value from false to true. So it's automatically tracked. Now, let's say I have an array, which is a non-primitive data type. And this time, let's say the array has two elements, 1 and 2.
Mhm.
Now, if I reassign, meaning that if I say A is equal to 2, 3, that means I'm reassigning its value. So it's tracked.
Mhm.
But
Hmm.
what happens if I use any function to push an element to the array? So let's say A is equal to 1, 2, and then I say A dot
Mhm.
push 3. In that case, just the element inside the array changes. The value itself doesn't change, meaning that it doesn't get reassigned. So that is the case when you need to explicitly put the track decorator to make sure the framework knows it doesn't just track the reassignment, but it also has to track any changes to the elements inside the array or map or whatever you create, which is a non-primitive data type. So that's the basic difference. So if you're reassigning, you're good to go. But if you're pushing elements, then you'll have to use track.
Got it. And then an early pitfall that you run into, you're leveraging rendered callback because you're trying to, constantly have your grid updated. But within the callback, you're also updating tracked values, causing the Lightning Web Component to render, which is then triggering rendered callback. What are some of the tricks that you can use in order to kind of control that flow so that rendered callback is only being utilized when you want it to?
So that's a trick most developers who have been working on the Salesforce platform are already familiar with.
Right.
I mean, if you think about triggers, and there is a concept called as recursive triggers. How do you prevent recursion and triggers? You do it using a static variable. So you declare it to be of some Boolean value, true or false. And then in the entire execution context, depending on what you want, you set it to true. And basically you put all of your logic inside an if condition that says, only if this value is true, then do this. If not, don't do it.
Got it.
So that static variable is used as a recursive control element. And that's the same concept we use in the rendered callback lifecycle also. So we declare a property on the class level and we set it to true or false depending on our use case. And then we just use toggle its value to determine whether a particular code in rendered callback has to run or not. So same concept, but different execution.
Yeah. Well, and talking about same concept, different execution, and kind of going back to the why question a little bit, when I look at the overall architecture of what you're putting together, you're setting up arrays, you're controlling arrays, you're feeding that into a callback loop. That data is getting mirrored into the user interface through the tracked variables. Like, how different does that sound to other components that you've actually built?
That sounds, other components don't use as much reactivity, meaning that, so the game is a continuously ongoing loop. So the other elements don't use as much of that concept of a continuous loop. But then the concept of changing something in the backend like an array and reflecting that on the front end is not new. So there is this use case where, let's say you want to, for the lack of a better example, add new filter values. So let's say you have a text box and then there is a button called add more. You click that add more button and then a new text box pops up. And then there is this ability where you can remove a text box. So that's a use case that is already prevalent. I've seen a lot of projects implement such a use case. So in that, what typically people tend to do is, let's say the moment I click on the add more button and I have to add a new input element, the general go-to tendency is call a JavaScript method that inserts a new element to the DOM. And as we already established, that manipulating DOM that way is slower. And it's a lot more cumbersome, meaning that if you add more, there are new elements that get added and then the page gets slower. You'll have to manually verify the indexes. And let's say you want to get the property value of a particular text box in this whole sequence. You're going to iterate through all of them. A lot of headaches come into picture. So instead of that, what you can actually do is define an array in the backend and treat each of these text boxes as new array elements. So you essentially create an array of objects. So whenever you click on add more, all you need to do is just add a new object to your array in JavaScript, and LWC takes care of rendering a new text box in the front end. So that way it's more efficient. And in your JavaScript, to get the value, you don't need to query DOM elements again. You have the value in JavaScript already. So that's much faster in terms of performance. And in terms of a developer experience, I think it's much more easier than you having to query DOM elements. Because one problem that I almost always see when querying DOM elements is that I end up querying the wrong class. Maybe I don't get that element also. Then I'll have to figure out, why this element is not being accessible. So all of that problems go away.
Nice. Well, in talking a little bit more about performance, one of the things that you did was you had two templates on the client, and both of them looking for the conditional of where the snake was effectively, and you reduced that down to one, where that one template was just looking for more dynamic variables to know how to render its CSS class, for instance. Like, how important is a change like that? Like, how much payoff do you actually see?
I think it's just a matter of personal preference and how you structure your code to be. There are advantages to both. Again, it comes down to, like I said, personal preference. If you want to split it into a different component in the future, so let's say, I think you're talking about the game over screen. That's rendered differently. So the way there are two ways of looking at it. I wanted the output to be an overlay on top of my existing DOM element, which is why I made that change. If let's say I had a use case where I didn't need that overlay, I just needed to remove everything and just show a message saying game over, then I could have implemented it differently. So it comes down to that. There is no real payoff between doing it either way, is what I would say.
Well, and I think it's interesting that you've provided yourself with a use case where, since it's iterating so quickly, that small changes like this are probably more noticeable, right? Because your UI is reacting, I think it was every 300 milliseconds was your timeout. So any improvement you're doing to LWC is kind of instantly noticeable. And that to me, that's actually, it's an interesting use test for somebody who, if you're trying to see your performance, that's one way you can kind of see it in real time.
Yeah, that's exactly true. Even frankly speaking, I was pleasantly surprised looking at it. So I thought the way I had implemented it, I thought it would work well. But what happened is, so let's say the snake was moving from left to right. Okay. And then once it crosses the boundary, I made it appear back on the left. So that seemed to work seamlessly because all of those DOM elements were one after the other in a sequence. But then when it was moving from the top to bottom and it tried to cross the boundary at the bottom and come to the top, that is when I noticed a significant lag. So then I was looking at the DOM structure and realized, okay, it's trying to get not to the next sequential element, but to some other element present somewhere else in the whole structure. Which is when I was like, okay, so now that I'm doing the re-render this rapidly, that is why there is a performance degradation. Ideally, in most of your production use cases, the components are not going to be this complex. So you wouldn't really notice it and understand how small tweaks can make the performance so much better.
Okay, so now you've got another video talking more broadly about performance on Lightning. First, maybe a thorny question, but if somebody is still on Classic because they think that's more performant, what would you say to them?
I would say no comments. Really. Because one thing definitely is that Lightning experience in terms of user experience. So if your customer is using Lightning experience in production mode, it's definitely much faster. And of course, Lightning experience is not just a page that shows you information from your database. It's much more interactive than that. So there are a lot more elements that Lightning experience adds on top of Classic. So from a customer standpoint, yes, Lightning experience is all the way to go. If you're still on Classic, migrate. But then when it comes to developer experience, that is sort of a mixed bag. So I have already seen, practically when I was working on that webinar, that let's say I wanted to go to the system administrator profile, let's say. To do that in Lightning Experience, because when I'm developing in sandboxes, I enable the development mode, and then the framework is not minified, and there is a lot going on.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say I want to get to profiles. It definitely takes a little bit longer than what it would do in Classic. So in Classic, I instantly see the profile page, but here the framework loads, the setup loads, and then the profile loads, I'm guessing, as an iframe inside it. So I get what developers are trying to say, but because developers are spending a lot of time in setup, and setup is really not as performant as the end user Lightning experience, I totally get why developers say Lightning experience is slower. But then, like I mentioned before, users using Salesforce don't spend a lot of time in setup. They just look at records, they go to tabs, and once the framework has loaded, all of it is pretty quick.
Yeah.
So that is what is my take on it, to be very transparent. So my session on performance was really focused on how better you can even more improve that end user experience.
Yeah.
As a developer, there is nothing much that we can do about it. Hoping that we would still come up with a lot more enhancements. Object Manager is the best enhancement I've seen. So instead of me navigating to objects and clicking on a particular object in Classic, that works, but Object Manager is much more functional. I get to filter through them easily, and I think Object Manager has moved away from that Classic experience in an iframe, which is why it is much faster. So I'm thinking, as in when we move setup from those classic iframe experiences to Lightning experience, developers will notice that improvement.
Yeah. And I think it's also good to point out for that end user experience, if I go back to my interviews with like Chris Gray and Kevin Hill, and they're talking about how the future of not just Lightning web components, but web components in general, is the browsers really being able to handle the heavy lifting and the tricks with the shadow DOM and all of the stuff that the framework's goal is to basically be rendered obsolete. And it's like that's a future of a really high performant web page that Classic will never see, because it does not have a path to that like standards based web framework where some future iteration of like Internet Explorer is going to be crazy fast. And I think there's lessons from the past that can work today. So for instance, I used to talk about Visualforce, and I can quote a Visualforce engineer here who used to always tell people, don't take your data truck up to the data dump. Like, don't pull all of the data down, because it's going to increase the size of the view state, which increases the size of the client to server track. But we don't have a view state in Lightning Web Components. But how true do you think that still is, that you should be trimming the fat in the terms of the data that you're trying to represent to the client?
Yeah, I think the answer is twofold. First thing is, can the user consume all of the data that you're showing to them?
Yes, good point.
So if you're able to, let's say, I think in the web terminology, it is called above the fold and below the fold. So when a web page loads, what is it that the user has to see? What is important to them?
Yeah.
Only if they really need something will they scroll or click something else. So what is the point of getting all that data, which you're anyways not going to show on the screen above the fold? So that's the first point of it, on why you need to lessen how much data you get. And the second one, of course, is your bandwidth. Take WhatsApp as an example.
Okay.
Maybe you have like you have an iPhone that takes a picture which is like 10 MB. But when you compress and send it over to your friends, it doesn't send a high quality image. It lowers the quality so that it is much more faster. Because not everyone is always on Wi-Fi. On mobile data also, you need to be able to get that same experience. So if you like download all of the data, let's say all the photos, everything in high quality, you might end up using 10 MB of data. And if my internet is slow, I keep looking at that page for half an hour. And that's not really an experience that you want customers to have.
Right.
And I actually speak about this from a very practical experience. So from my previous company, there was a client where they don't always sit in front of a system. They're a property-based company. So they go out on the field. They go to that apartment and they do something on CRM for that. They like inspect and they take down notes. They use Salesforce for a lot of things on site.
Mhm.
And on site, they might not always have good coverage of internet. So how do you make sure those people are able to better work with Salesforce? Of
Mhm.
course, offline is one way to go, but then your Lightning experience, if let's say they don't want offline, they want it always to be live, but
Yeah.
still be as performant. That is when data comes into picture.
Mhm.
That is one classic shift from, yeah, pun intended, classic to Lightning. Is that, like you already mentioned, Visualforce and all, they render on the server and then it comes to the client. So your whole
Mhm.
HTML dump along with your data comes at once.
Yeah.
But with Lightning experience, it's all browser. JavaScript loads your framework. It does most of the heavy lifting, and you only need to go to the server for data.
Mhm.
If the framework and the browser is taking so much of load, why do you want to get all of the data and increase its load? So that is what is important. And the second or third, I think, most important thing is your memory on the system.
Mhm.
You can clearly see a performance degradation if you're, let's say, rendering 10,000 rows of data or
Mhm.
CSV on your browser, because your data is coming in, which is good, but then you're doing something to render it on the browser. And each browser render, let's say you have a text that you're getting, you're creating an HTML element for it. So the more number of HTML elements that you keep adding to your browser, the more performance hit it is going to take.
Mhm.
Unless you have like a 64 gig RAM, you're going to notice degradation when the number
Yeah.
of DOM elements on your browser increase.
Yeah.
So that is, there are so many nitty-gritties to why you should not get a lot of data. It's not just always data size, but it can also
Mhm.
be rendering problems.
Yeah. Well, and you do a great job in the video of highlighting specifically like where in the transactions, you kind of have control and you don't have control. Obviously, we will be linking to that in the show notes because it's great stuff, and we only have a half hour to talk about an hour's worth of webinar kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
small correction there. It's
yeah.
not an hour's worth of webinar. It is one of my longest webinars ever. It's like 1 hour 40 minutes. I think movies are smaller than that.
I love it. Okay, so let's quickly shift topics. Just to give it a shout out, the India crew has been working on a new series called Dev Talkies. Tell me more about Dev Talkies.
Okay, so these sort of ideas stem from lockdown. If you're sitting in your home, you get all of these ideas.
Mhm.
But seriously speaking, like 6 months into the whole lockdown, even we started getting vexed up with all of the technical content out there. So every day I see there is some or the other technical session, and it's like an overdose of so much technical talk.
Yeah.
So we had this idea back then where we do something fun while still keeping it relevant for developers.
Uh-huh.
And that is where this whole idea of Dev Talkies came in. But then it took this time to materialize, and we were finally able to do it in January. But the core intention behind doing Dev Talkies is doing something that is not purely technical.
Okay.
So you're looking at a talk show, you're getting to know about people, and at the same time, there are one or two technical aspects to it that you intrinsically learn from that session. So we have sprinkled technical topics all over the talk show in a way that there is a interview that Kiran does with one of our guests. Immediately, we follow it up with a 2 or 3 minutes quick tip on how you can do something. So you're looking at the interview, you're inspired, you're in that zone, and then suddenly a technical tip drops. So then you pay attention to that. And the fun element really comes in during the game show.
Okay.
And which I'm hosting.
Nice.
So in the game show, we picked popular games and we've added Salesforce flavor to it.
Okay.
So it's still fun, but you learn also in the process. So we are trying to incorporate that learning everywhere, but it doesn't seem like you're sitting in a technical session and taking in all the knowledge. Right. It's like you're looking at, let's say, somebody else play the game, and then if they make a mistake, I think that's how you remember stuff better. If you see somebody making a mistake and then there is an explanation given to why that is wrong, that's when you retain it a lot. And I think that's helping. People are loving the game show.
Nice.
But yeah, that's the primary motivation behind doing a talk show amidst of all of the overdose of technical content.
And that's our show note. In the show notes, we will have links to both of Aditya's presentations if you want to book a little time to watch those yourselves. There's a lot of great detail in them. Now, before we go, I did ask after his favorite non-technical hobby.
My favorite non-technical hobby, recently I picked up painting.
Oh, nice.
So I bought a lot of canvases, which I'm yet to paint. So yeah, I've picked up that as a hobby, and I'm planning to decorate my home with all of my paintings.
Nice.
And hopefully 100 years down the line, they are of some value.
They'll still be around. Any particular style of painting?
I'm not yet that mature. Hopefully they'll name that style after me.
Nice. I want to thank Aditya for the great conversation and information. And as always, I want to thank you for listening. Now, if you want to learn more about this show, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes, see the show notes, and have links to your favorite podcast service. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you next week.